Margaret sat alone, in the same chair she had sat in for the past 50 years. Today was her birthday, her 84th, to be exact. She looked around her quiet, empty home. The same home where her children had grown up, where laughter once echoed through the halls, where birthdays used to be filled with love, joy, and family. But now, the house was silent. She had prepared everything: a cake, a few balloons, and a table set for guests. She had even dressed up, hoping that maybe this year would be different. But the hours passed, and no one came. No calls, no knocks at the door, just the ticking of the clock, reminding her of the time slipping away. Margaret couldn't help but wonder, had they forgotten her? Before we continue, if you're feeling moved by Margaret's story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss what happens next. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for the small slice of cake she had cut for herself. The candles flickered softly, casting shadows in the dim room. She took a deep breath and made a wish. But it wasn't the kind of wish you make when you're 8 years old, surrounded by friends and family. No, this wish was different. This wish was simple: that someone, anyone, would remember her before it was too late. Margaret stared at the candle's flame, her eyes glazing over as memories flooded her mind. She remembered her younger days, when her children were small, how every birthday had been a grand event. The house would be filled with laughter, the smell of fresh-baked cake, and the pitter-patter of tiny feet running through the living room. Back then, she was never alone. Her husband, her children, even the neighbors, everyone would gather. There would be music, games, and joy. But that was a long time ago. Her husband had passed 10 years earlier, leaving her with a silence she never thought she'd have to endure. And her children? Well, they were busy with their own lives now. Too busy, it seemed. A text message here, a phone call there, but rarely in person. She hadn't seen them in months. She didn't blame them, of course. Life gets busy. She always told herself that. But deep down, the loneliness weighed heavy on her heart. As she sat in that empty house, the ticking of the clock grew louder, echoing through the hollow space like a cruel reminder of all the time that had passed. Margaret's heart ached as she thought of all the times she had been there for them. The countless sacrifices, the sleepless nights when one of them was sick, the endless support when they needed her most. She had been their rock, their foundation. And now, it seemed, she had been forgotten. Her hand shook as she reached for a photograph on the table next to her. It was a picture of her family, taken years ago. She looked at the faces of her children, smiling, full of life and promise. They had grown up, moved away, started families of their own. They had careers, busy schedules, lives filled with things she didn't understand. It was as if time had moved forward for everyone but her. Margaret wiped away a tear that slid down her cheek. "It's just a birthday," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. It wasn't about the cake or the balloons, or even the gifts. It was about feeling seen, feeling loved, feeling remembered. She had spent her whole life giving love to others, but on this day, her special day, there was no one there to give it back. She thought about calling her daughter, but the last time she had called, her daughter had been too busy to talk. "Maybe later, Mom," she had said, in that distracted tone that Margaret had grown used to hearing. Maybe later. The words echoed in her mind like a broken promise. Margaret stood up from her chair, her legs stiff from sitting too long. She walked slowly to the window and looked outside. The street was empty. No cars, no visitors. No one coming to celebrate with her. She could feel the tears welling up again, but she blinked them away. She didn't want to cry. Not today. Not on her birthday. But the ache in her chest was too much to bear. Suddenly, a memory from long ago surfaced. Her 8th birthday. She had been a little girl then, full of hope and excitement. She had waited all day for her friends to come, but they never showed up. She remembered sitting on the front porch, watching the sun go down, wondering why no one came. And now, here she was, all these years later, waiting again, waiting for someone to remember her, waiting for someone to care. But no one came. Margaret sat back down, her hands resting on her lap. She stared at the small cake in front of her, the candle still flickering. The silence in the room was deafening, but there was no one to fill it. She closed her eyes and made one last wish, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone would walk through the door. But deep down, she knew the truth. No one was coming. As the hours ticked by, Margaret found herself lost in the memories of birthdays long past. The sound of children's laughter echoed faintly in her mind, like a distant melody she could no longer reach. She remembered the chaos of raising 3 children, each one with their own dreams and struggles. How every year she had baked their favorite cakes, thrown the biggest parties, and made sure that they felt celebrated. She had always been there for them, through every scraped knee, every heartbreak, every milestone. But now, those memories felt like ghosts, haunting her as she sat in the quiet of her living room. The loneliness clung to her like a heavy blanket, suffocating her with the weight of her isolation. She picked up her phone, scrolling through the contacts, seeing the names of her children and grandchildren. Each name was like a dagger to her heart, reminding her of how far away they were. Physically, yes, but more than that, emotionally. She thought about calling her son this time, but she hesitated. The last time they spoke, his voice had been rushed, impatient. He was too busy with work, too tired from the long hours at the office. "I'll call you later, Mom," he had said. But later never came. It never did. She had learned not to expect much from those promises, but it still hurt every time. Margaret set the phone down without making a call. She didn't want to be a burden, didn't want to hear that same rehearsed excuse about how life had become too hectic, how there wasn't enough time. She knew all too well what that meant. It meant there wasn't time for her anymore. The same woman who had once been their whole world had now become an afterthought. Outside, the sky began to darken as the day slowly faded into evening. Margaret watched as the streetlights flickered on, one by one, casting long shadows on the empty road. She had once loved watching the sunset from her porch, sitting with her husband as they talked about everything and nothing. But he was gone now, and the sunset had lost its warmth. It was just another reminder of everything she had lost. As the light outside dimmed, so did the small flame on the birthday candle. Margaret watched it flicker, struggling to stay lit. In that tiny flame, she saw herself, fighting to keep going, even as the world around her seemed to forget she was still here. She had always been strong, always resilient. But now, in this moment, on this lonely birthday, even her strength was beginning to wane. The phone buzzed softly on the table. Margaret's heart leapt with a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, one of her children had remembered. She picked up the phone quickly, her fingers trembling as she swiped to see the message. But it wasn't what she had hoped for. It was a reminder from the pharmacy that her prescription was ready for pickup. Her heart sank once again, the tiny spark of hope extinguished. She let out a long sigh, placing the phone back on the table. The room felt colder now, the emptiness more profound. The world outside was moving on, busy and alive, while Margaret sat frozen in time, waiting for someone to notice that she was still here. But they didn't. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second passing by without acknowledgement. The walls of her home, once filled with the noise of family, now felt like a cage, trapping her in a reality she never thought she'd face. Margaret stood up once more, her body aching from the weight of the years she carried. She walked to the bookshelf and pulled down an old photo album, blowing the dust off the cover. Sitting back down, she opened it slowly, the pages filled with memories of happier times. There were pictures of her children's birthdays, her wedding day, family vacations, all moments that had once brought so much joy. She traced her fingers over the photographs, feeling the paper beneath her skin, but the people in the pictures felt like strangers now. She flipped to the last page of the album. There, tucked into the corner, was a photograph of her and her husband on their last anniversary together. They were smiling, standing in front of their house, arms wrapped around each other. It had been a good day, a day filled with love and laughter, a day when she had felt like she mattered. But that day was gone, just like her husband, just like everything. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as she closed the album and set it aside. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself, but the loneliness was too overwhelming. She hadn't cried like this in years, but today was different. Today was supposed to be special, but instead, it was just a painful reminder of all the things she had lost. Margaret looked at the cake again, the candle now nothing more than a melted pool of wax. She hadn't even made a real wish. What was there left to wish for? Her family had moved on without her. Her husband was gone. Her friends were gone. And now, she was left with nothing but memories, faded, distant memories of a life that had once been so full of love. Margaret's tears continued to fall, each drop carrying the weight of years of silence, loneliness, and longing. She sat there, staring at the remnants of the candle, feeling more disconnected from the world than ever before. The darkness outside seemed to seep into the room, surrounding her, swallowing the warmth that had once filled her life. She thought about standing up, about turning on the lights, but even that felt like too much effort. The emptiness was too heavy, too suffocating. For a moment, she wondered what would happen if she didn't wake up tomorrow. Would anyone notice? Would her children eventually realize they hadn't heard from her in days? Weeks, perhaps? Or would her absence go unnoticed, like a whisper lost in the wind? The thought chilled her to the bone, but it wasn't a fear of death that gripped her. It was the fear of being forgotten entirely. To live a life and have no one remember, no one care. That was the true terror. She closed her eyes, the memories swirling in her mind like a film reel playing on repeat. There was the image of her daughter's wedding, the tears of joy in her eyes as she watched her walk down the aisle, the laughter of her son on his graduation day, the pride swelling in her chest as he received his diploma, the birth of her first grandchild, the moment she held that tiny life in her arms and felt an overwhelming surge of love. These were the moments that had defined her existence, the moments that had given her life meaning. But now, they were just flickers of a past that felt so far away. The sound of a car passing by outside jolted her from her thoughts. For a brief second, she hoped it was one of her children, pulling up to surprise her to say, "We didn't forget, Mom." But the car drove past, disappearing into the night, just like all the others. Her heart sank again, the hope slipping away just as quickly as it had come. She was alone, truly alone. Margaret thought about the neighbors. They used to visit, bringing over cakes or casseroles, stopping by to chat for a few minutes. But those visits had become less frequent over the years, and now they too had stopped. People had their own lives, their own problems. Who had time to check on the old lady down the street? She didn't blame them, really. She understood, but that understanding didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. Her gaze drifted to the mantel, where an old clock sat, ticking away the seconds. It had been her wedding gift from her parents, an antique, passed down through generations. The ticking was steady, rhythmic, almost comforting in its predictability. But tonight, it felt like a countdown, a reminder of how much time had passed, how much time she had left. Each tick seemed to echo in her chest, amplifying the silence that surrounded her. She tried to shake off the dark thoughts, to remind herself that she had lived a good life. She had raised her children with love, given them everything she had. She had been a good wife, a good mother. But as she sat there in the cold and empty house, it was hard to feel like any of that mattered. What good was a life well lived if there was no one left to share it with? Margaret looked back at the small cake on the table. The frosting had started to melt, the once vibrant colors now dull and lifeless. Just like the day, she had hoped for something different, something more. But this was her reality now. Quiet, forgotten, left behind. She couldn't help but wonder if this was how it would be from now on. If every birthday, every holiday, every day would be marked by the same crushing solitude. She thought about all the times she had told her children to visit, to spend time with her, to call. "We'll visit soon, Mom," they'd say, with that same dismissive tone that made her feel like an obligation, an afterthought. Soon. It was always soon. But soon never came. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and before she knew it, another year had passed. Another year where she sat alone, waiting for someone to remember. The pain in her chest grew stronger as she realized how long it had been since she'd heard her children's voices, since she had hugged them, since they had called her Mom, with that same warmth they used to have as kids. Now, everything felt distant, cold. It was as if she had been erased from their lives, just a name in their contact list, an afterthought in their busy schedules. Her thoughts drifted to her husband again. He would have known what to say, how to make her feel better. He always did. He was her rock, her companion through every challenge, every joy. But now he was gone too, and she was left to face the world alone. She missed him more than words could express. Sometimes she would talk to him, as if he were still sitting in his favorite chair, as if he could still hear her. She liked to think that maybe, just maybe, he was watching over her, keeping her company in the only way he could. But tonight, even that comfort felt distant. The darkness outside deepened, and the house seemed to grow colder. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill, but it wasn't just the cold air that made her shiver. It was the emptiness, the isolation. She glanced at the clock again. Time was slipping away, just as it always had, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The hours would pass, the day would end, and tomorrow would be just like today. Quiet, lonely, forgotten. As the night grew darker, Margaret's thoughts became heavier, sinking deeper into the quiet despair that surrounded her. The world outside continued to move on without her, oblivious to the fact that inside this small, dimly lit house, an old woman was silently breaking apart. She glanced again at the phone on the table, but she didn't reach for it this time. What was the point? She already knew no one would call, no one would show up. Margaret tried to remember the last time her house had been filled with people, the last time there had been any life within these walls. It had been years, so many years that the memories felt like they belonged to someone else. Her children had grown up, moved away, and with them, the energy of the home had vanished. The once bustling kitchen, where she had cooked countless meals for her family, now sat unused. The living room, once filled with the sounds of her children playing and her husband's laughter, was now just a collection of old furniture and fading memories. She had spent her life taking care of others. Her entire identity had been wrapped up in being a mother, a wife, a caregiver. And now, with no one left to care for, she didn't know who she was anymore. The years had taken everything from her, her youth, her vitality, her family. And now, it seemed, even her purpose was gone. Margaret sighed deeply, her chest heavy with the weight of the years. She felt tired, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. It was the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix, the kind of tiredness that came from living too long without being seen, without being heard. She had become invisible, a ghost in her own life. Her mind drifted back to her husband, to the years they had spent together. He had been her partner, her best friend, her anchor. They had built a life together, raised a family, shared dreams and hopes. But now, without him, everything felt empty. She missed him every single day. Sometimes, in the quiet moments like this, she would imagine him sitting beside her, his hand on hers, telling her that everything was going to be okay. But he wasn't there, and she wasn't okay. Margaret stood up slowly, her legs weak, and walked to the mantel where their wedding photo sat in a simple frame. She picked it up, tracing her fingers over the image of their younger selves. They had been so full of life back then, so full of hope. She could still remember the day they said their vows, the way he looked at her, promising to be with her in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, until death do us part. He had kept his promise. He had stayed with her until the very end. But death had parted them, And now, she was the one left behind. She set the photo back down, her hands trembling. Her eyes were wet with tears again, but she didn't bother to wipe them away this time. What was the point? She was alone. No one would see her cry, and no one would comfort her. The sadness that filled her was too deep, too vast to express in words. It was an ache that had settled in her bones, a quiet, constant grief that she carried with her every day. Margaret walked slowly back to the chair, her body feeling heavier with each step. She sat down, staring at the cold, empty cake in front of her. The candles had long since melted, the room was dark, and the silence was louder than ever. The house felt like a tomb now, a place where memories had come to die. And Margaret realized, with a sinking feeling, that she was just waiting for her own turn to be forgotten too. The clock on the wall continued its steady ticking, each second passing with an almost cruel inevitability. Time moved forward, always forward, but for Margaret, it felt like she was stuck in place, frozen in this moment of solitude. The years had slipped away, and now all that was left was the waiting. Waiting for someone to call, waiting for someone to visit, waiting for something to change. But nothing ever did. She thought about her children again. She had done everything for them, given them everything she had. But now, it seemed, they had no room left for her in their lives. She understood that they had their own families, their own responsibilities. But that didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. She had spent her life making sure they were never alone. But now, in her old age, she was the one who had been left behind. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the tears fall freely now. She wasn't angry at her children, not really. She was just sad. Sad that life had turned out this way, that the world had moved on without her. Sad that, on the day she was supposed to be celebrated, she was instead sitting alone in the dark, with nothing but her memories for company. She thought about what it would be like to leave this world. Would anyone even notice? Would anyone care? Would her children come to her funeral out of obligation, just like they did with their phone calls, their occasional visits? The thought made her heart ache even more. She didn't want to be a burden to them, but she also didn't want to be forgotten. She just wanted to matter, to someone, to anyone. But tonight, it seemed, she didn't. Margaret opened her eyes again, staring at the dark room around her. The house felt colder now, the walls closing in on her. She could almost hear the echoes of the past. Her children's laughter, her husband's voice, the sound of life that had once filled these walls. But those days were gone, and they weren't coming back. All that was left was the quiet, the darkness, and the steady ticking of the clock. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She didn't know how much longer she could go on like this. The loneliness, the emptiness. It was too much to bear. She had been strong for so long, but now, even her strength was failing her. She didn't know how to live in a world where she was no longer needed, no longer wanted. Margaret sat there, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her like a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe. The darkness of the room seemed to mirror the darkness inside her heart, where hope had once lived, but was now nothing more than a faint flicker, slowly dying out. She thought of all the years she had spent building a life, raising a family, giving everything she had to the people she loved, and now, here she was sitting alone, wondering if it had all been for nothing. She tried to push the thought away, but it clung to her, refusing to let go. Had her life really been reduced to this? A forgotten old woman, sitting alone on her birthday, with no one left to care? The ache in her chest grew deeper, and she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the cold that seemed to seep not just into her skin, but into her very soul. The silence in the house was unbearable now, louder than any noise could ever be. It filled every corner, every room, reminding her of all that had been lost. She thought of the times when the house had been full of life, when her children had run through the halls, their laughter filling the air. She remembered the way her husband had wrapped his arms around her in the kitchen, whispering in her ear as they danced to the radio, the smell of dinner cooking in the background. Those moments felt like a lifetime ago, and now, All she had left were memories, fading and distant. Her thoughts drifted back to her children. She had always been so proud of them, had watched them grow into the people they were today, full of potential, full of life. But somewhere along the way, they had drifted apart. It wasn't intentional, she knew that. Life had a way of pulling people in different directions. But that knowledge didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. She remembered when they were younger, how they used to run to her, wrapping their little arms around her neck, their faces lighting up when they saw her. "Mommy, Mommy." They would cry, and her heart would swell with so much love she thought it might burst. She would give anything to feel that again, to hold them close, to hear their voices filled with joy and excitement. But now, when they called, if they called, it was different. The warmth was gone, replaced by a formality that felt cold and distant. "Hi, Mom. Just calling to check in." The words felt rehearsed, like something they said out of obligation rather than love. She didn't blame them. She knew they were busy, knew they had lives of their own, but that didn't stop the hurt. It didn't stop the feeling of being left behind, forgotten. Margaret's eyes wandered to the small clock on the wall. The ticking was steady, relentless, each second slipping away, marking the passage of time. How many more birthdays would she spend like this? How many more days would pass in this quiet, empty house, with no one to talk to, no one to share the little moments with? The thought of it made her feel even more tired, more worn down by the weight of her solitude. She stood up, her legs shaky beneath her, and walked to the window. Outside, the world continued on as if nothing had changed. Cars passed by. People walked their dogs. Life moved forward. But for Margaret, it felt like time had stopped. She was frozen in place, stuck in a life that no longer felt like her own. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, watching the world go by, wondering if anyone out there knew what it felt like to be so alone. She thought about her neighbors. She used to know them, used to chat with them over the fence, share cups of coffee on the porch. But that was years ago. The old neighbors had moved away, replaced by younger families, people with busy lives, who barely had time to wave as they hurried off to work or to drop their kids off at school. They didn't know her, and she didn't know them. It was as if the world had moved on without her, and she had been left behind, a relic of a time long past. Margaret turned away from the window, feeling more alone than ever. She walked slowly back to her chair, sinking into the cushions as if they could somehow hold her together. But the sadness was too deep, too overwhelming. She closed her eyes, letting the tears fall freely now, no longer trying to hold them back. What was the point? There was no one here to see her cry, no one here to tell her it would be okay. Her mind drifted back to her husband. Oh, how she missed him. He had been her anchor, the one who had always been there to lift her up when she felt like she couldn't go on. He had been her partner in everything, her best friend, the love of her life. But now he was gone, and she was left to face the world alone. She thought about how, even in their toughest times, they had always had each other. They had faced the challenges of life together, hand in hand, never letting go. But now, she was the one left behind, and the world felt so much darker without him by her side. Margaret looked at the empty chair next to hers, the one her husband had always sat in. She could almost see him there, smiling at her, telling her that everything would be all right, that she wasn't alone. But it was just an illusion, a memory of a time when she hadn't been so lost, so forgotten. She wanted to reach out, to touch him, to hold on to something real, but there was nothing there, just a cold, empty chair. She sighed, the sound of her breath echoing in the quiet room. The tears had stopped, but the sadness lingered, heavy and unrelenting. She wasn't sure how much longer she could go on like this. Every day felt the same. Every moment stretched out before her like an endless expanse of nothingness. She had always been strong, but now, even her strength was failing her. The loneliness was too much, too overwhelming. Margaret glanced at the cake on the table once more. The candles had long since gone out, leaving behind only melted wax and a reminder of what this day was supposed to be. She had made a wish earlier, but now, even that felt hollow. What was the point of wishing for something that would never come? She had wished for someone to remember, someone to care. But no one had come. No one had remembered. And in that moment, Margaret realized that maybe no one ever would. Margaret sat in the silence, the weight of the years pressing down on her like an unbearable burden. Her body felt heavy, her heart even more so. The coldness of the empty house was almost too much to bear, and for a moment, she wondered if this was how it would end. Just her alone, with nothing but memories that had long since faded into shadows. But just as the thought settled in her mind, something unexpected happened. There was a knock at the door. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She sat up straighter, unsure if she had imagined it. The house had been so quiet for so long that even the smallest sound felt unreal. She waited, holding her breath, her mind racing. And then there was again a soft, gentle knock. Slowly, Margaret stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. She wasn't sure what to expect. Who could it be at this hour? She made her way to the door, her hand shaking as she reached for the handle. She paused for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, before finally turning the knob and pulling the door open. Standing there on her doorstep was her youngest grandson, Tommy. His face was flushed from the cold, and in his hands he held a small bouquet of flowers and a card. Behind him, Margaret saw the headlights of a car parked at the curb, where her daughter waved from the driver's seat. "Hi, Grandma," Tommy said, his voice soft and full of love. "I'm sorry we're late, but we didn't forget your birthday." Margaret's breath caught in her throat as tears welled up in her eyes once more, but this time they were tears of joy. She knelt down at Tommy's level, pulling him into a tight hug, feeling the warmth of his small body against hers. It was as if all the loneliness, all the sadness, had melted away in an instant. "Oh, Tommy," she whispered, her voice trembling. I thought no one was coming." Tommy pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes wide and full of sincerity. "We would never forget you, Grandma," he said, handing her the flowers. "Mom said we were just running late because of the traffic, but I wanted to come as soon as we could." Margaret stood up, still holding her grandson's hand, and looked over at the car where her daughter was now getting out, smiling apologetically as she made her way to the door. Margaret's heart swelled with emotion as she realized that, even though the day hadn't gone the way she had hoped, she wasn't forgotten. Her family had come, just like they always had. "Mom," her daughter said, wrapping her arms around Margaret. "I'm so sorry we're late. We wanted to be here sooner, but you know how life gets. But I promise we're here now, and we're going to make this birthday special." Margaret smiled through her tears, pulling her daughter and grandson close. The sadness that had once weighed her down was now lifting, replaced by a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't alone, not anymore. Together, they walked into the house, and for the first time in what felt like years, the silence was broken by the sound of laughter and conversation. Tommy helped Margaret light a new candle on the cake, and as the flame flickered, Margaret made a new wish. But this time, it wasn't a wish for someone to come, or for someone to remember her. This time, she wished for moments like these to last forever. The small family gathered around the table, and as Margaret blew out the candle, she realized that even in the moments when she had felt most alone, there was always love waiting for her. Sometimes it just took a little longer to arrive. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt truly happy. Margaret sat back, watching as her grandson devoured a slice of birthday cake, her daughter laughing at his enthusiasm. The house, once so quiet, was now alive with the sounds of family, sounds she had missed so deeply. As the warmth of the moment filled the room, Margaret knew, without a doubt, that she was loved and that she had never been forgotten. As Margaret sat with her family, her heart full of warmth and love, she realized that even in her darkest moments, hope was never truly lost. There was always a chance for things to change, for love to find its way back. And now she was no longer alone. The laughter of her grandson, the embrace of her daughter, these were the moments that mattered most. And as the candle's flame flickered out, Margaret knew that no matter how many birthdays came and went, she would never feel forgotten again. If you've been touched by Margaret's story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and stay with us for more stories that remind us all of the power of love, family, and hope. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you in the next one.